All right. Kia ora koutou katoa. He mihi nui kia koutou. My name's Andrew Macaulay. I'm a policy advisor at the PSA, Te Pukenga Here Tikanga Mahi. And welcome along to our webinar today. Please feel free to say hello, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like to, just while we're getting started. And so, yeah, thanks heaps for joining us for this webinar today, a plan for the climate. This is part of a budget webinar series that the PSA has been running in the lead up to the budget. So if you were watching last week, you may have caught Bernard Hickey and Craig Rennie, economists, talking about a budget for working people, and Max Rashbrook talking about a budget for inequality and climate. And today we're talking more about climate. In particular, we're talking about the emissions reduction plan that the government released on Monday, and some predictions or speculation about the budget content on climate for the budget that's coming out tomorrow. So before we get into it, I'll just start us off with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, te teo hi huka he hauhu, te hei muri ora. All right, so on Monday, the government released its emissions reduction plan, and tomorrow it will be releasing the budget. And so those two things are kind of what we're here to talk about today. So the stuff that we were going to look at is kind of what's in the emissions reduction plan and what's not, and what would a plan need to look like if it was really going to deliver action for the action that we need on climate change. And to help us do that, we've got a few guests from organisations that have been doing a ton of mahi on this area. So first up we have Christine Rose from Greenpeace. So everyone is probably very, very familiar with Greenpeace because they've been one of the world's most well-known environmental NGOs involved in activism on a whole lot of environmental issues since basically long before I was born, I think, and as long as any of us can remember. Christine is Greenpeace Aotearoa's lead agriculture campaigner. She grew up in the dairy heartland of Waikato and still lives semi-rurally. She has degrees in political science and philosophy. And for 15 years, she was an elected councillor on the rural Rodney District Council and then the Auckland Regional Council, where she was deputy chair. And before working for Greenpeace, she was a campaigner for World Animal Protection and other NGOs. She's an advocate for walking, cycling, public transport and the environment, and is involved in a whole lot of community development initiatives and is a proud PSA member. So welcome, Christine.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Nice to be here today and thanks for the opportunity. I am going to get rid of the pictures of us all so I can run through my slideshow. Thanks for the introduction. So the emissions reduction plan, it was delayed, and when it finally came, it was much anticipated, but does it actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions as the name says it should? And does it do it in an equitable, proportionate and effective way? The picture that you can see on the slide shows the net emissions profile, and this is from the latest greenhouse gas inventory. And you can see it's heavily weighted towards agriculture. And it's important to remember that this is net rather than gross. And the picture for gross is much more gross because a lot of the emissions will be offset in this picture by our tree cover. So you can see that agriculture makes up a huge amount, not just of CO2, but those really potent gases, methane and nitrous oxide. And that's also shown in this diagram, where the 50% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to agriculture. That's a couple of % increase from the last greenhouse gas inventory. And the most significant contributor to that greenhouse gas profile is from the intensive dairy sector at 23.5%. So really significant, and it means that agriculture, but in particular intensive dairy, is our most significant climate polluter. But it's not just about the cows. synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use has grown by 693%, so a whopping amount since the 1990s, as it is applied wholesale across our landscapes, and not just confined to the pasture, but into wetlands and to our coastal marine receiving environment, as a way of enhancing the productivity of our pasture, because we've got too many cows just for grass alone under natural conditions to support. So huge volumes of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer are applied every year. And the emissions contribution from synthetic nitrogen fertilizer alone are more than double that of the domestic aviation sector. I'm going to move to the next slide.
Sorry to interrupt, Christine, but we just had a question in the chat. Would you be able to put your slideshow onto present mode just to make it a bit bigger for?
Yes, good
people?
point. Let me see how I might do that.
It's on your right hand side next to share. There you go.
The slideshow. That should help.
Awesome.
Cool.
That looks good.
Thanks. Yeah, good on you. Thanks for noting that and for the feedback from the audience. So you can see in this slide how the total dairy herd has grown over the last 30 years in particular, but it's it's huge. So the dairy herd itself has more than doubled since 1990, and in some areas it's even more than that. It's grown 10 times in Canterbury and 15 times in Southland. So huge volumes of cows, and that's supported by huge volumes of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, but also by external inputs such as palm kernel expiller, which is New Zealand's now the world's most significant or the greatest user of PKE to feed cows in the world. And we import 2 million tonnes a year, and that's implicated in the illegal deforestation of Indonesian rainforest as well. So the effects aren't just here in New Zealand, but elsewhere too. And that means cumulatively that we're exceeding the planet's boundaries in terms of biodiversity loss, the nitrogen cycle, and climate change. And this can be directly pinned back to the agricultural sector and the intensive dairy industry in particular. So the wish list for Greenpeace for the emissions reduction plan was pretty simple, and it was quite clear because we put it on a 4-story billboard late last year in Wellington in a couple of locations, reminding the Prime Minister that it was a climate emergency, as she said, and indeed our nuclear-free moment. And we reminded her about the climate emergency to-do list, which she seemed to have lost. Maybe it's still lost because, she stopped new offshore oil and gas exploration, sort of. It seems to be diminishing a bit because OMV are back and there is still more exploration happening. She said some great stuff about the nuclear-free moment, but actually we really need to phase out synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and to farm far fewer dairy cows. And we need to back regenerative farming instead of intensive agriculture as we do at the moment. And so the emissions reduction plan, much delayed, much anticipated, but actually we're calling it an emissions ridiculous plan because it really does so little, in fact, nothing to shift the dial on industrial dairy. So, there's this giant cow-shaped hole in the plan. James Shaw is being pummeled by the cows, by the sector, saying that everything's fine. The Prime Minister seems oblivious to the issue, and David Parker and other ministers seem to think it's not a problem, that the nitrous oxide and methane in particular from the bloated dairy herd is such a significant part of our emissions profile, leading to climate change, which we are feeling the effects of right now. And farmers are not immune from that either. A drought was declared this week in Waikato, and we saw a drought in Southland recently. Wetlands are burning, sea level rise is happening at twice the rate anticipated. And you might wonder why, if climate change is our nuclear-free moment, is action not being taken? And it seems that the meat and dairy industry, along with the fossil fuel industry and the energy sector, ball and chains around the Prime Minister's leg, and it's leading to a collective failure to take the necessary action. And that action would look like phasing out synthetic nitrogen fertiliser and reducing the dairy herd as recommended by the Climate Change Commission. And so you might have seen this meme doing the rounds, and we would say the New Zealand dairy industry be like, oh, we get a third of the ERP spending, but contributed nothing. So you'll know that agriculture and the dairy sector are not in the emissions trading scheme. And even He Waka Eke Noa, the agri-industry partnership that has been developed to keep them out of the scheme that everybody else has to pay towards, He Waka Eke Noa is likely to only generate emissions reductions of less than 1%, although the latest version released in February trumped up the achievements from that by saying that the waste sector would contribute to the agricultural sector's emissions reductions, and so would the fertiliser cap of 190 kilos per hectare of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser that was applied under the freshwater reforms. But unfortunately, federated farmers are appealing those freshwater reforms, and you'll see, and it'll be known to no surprise to anybody that the sector is fighting those freshwater reforms as well as every other effort to get the industry to clean up their act, both in terms of freshwater pollution and climate change. So what about the cows? The emissions reduction plan was a win for agriculture, but not for the environment. And this table here that you can see from the Climate Change Commission and MFE, released under the Official Information Act, recommended that we should be decreasing the dairy herd by 7% by 2025 and 13% by 2030. And also the land used for dairy by 16,000 hectares by 2025 and 37,000 hectares by 2030. And yet the emissions reduction plan doesn't even mention any of this. In fact, not only does agriculture and intensive dairy not pay anything, but it gets 339 million for the Centre for Climate Action on Agriculture, which will see some hypothetical techno fixers trying to develop their way out of producing emissions rather than just turning off the tap. And what makes it worse is that agriculture is projected to make up an increasing proportion of future emissions budgets, 54% this year, 63% for the next emissions budget, and 76% of the country's emissions budget for future iterations. And Damien O'Connor has been in the media saying, oh no, they're gonna, agriculture will do more in the future. But it's like mañana, it never comes. And if we can't have confidence in this government to reduce agricultural emissions, it's very unlikely that future governments will be bound to reduce them either. There are no policies to reduce synthetic nitrogen fertiliser or the dairy herd. And in fact, this massive subsidy for the dairy sector, and that's coming from everyday New Zealanders, probably increases the social licence of the dairy industry to pollute the climate, but also fresh water and to contaminate people's drinking water. So what hopes do we have for the budget? We hope that the government will support regenerative farming through a $1 billion regenerative farming fund. Although to be more precise, we support, along the same lines as the recommendations from the IPCC, more plant-based regenerative organic agriculture. And plant-based diets are an important solution to climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource scarcity. So the government needs to level the playing field and make it easier for plant-based regenerative organic farmers to develop their markets and exports overseas. So that would look like more support for composting and organic farming. The budget needs to include more for walking and cycling. And you might know that under the ERP, there was $350 million for walking and cycling, but remember there was $339 million for the Agri-Industry Centre. So, it's not fair, and there's more public benefit for putting more money into walking and cycling. And wearing another hat, we really can't achieve the vehicle Ks travelled that are necessary to address climate change if we don't have a walking and cycling facility across the Auckland Harbour Bridge, and yet that's been scuppered. So we need much more investment in walking and cycling and public transport, in plant-based regenerative organic farming, and solar panels on people's roofs, and sustainable insulation in people's homes, and distributed finances rather than concentrated in the hands of the dairy sector. And that's it from me. But thanks very much. That was pretty quick and very simple, because the dairy sector is being treated unfairly and the rest of us are carrying the costs. Kia ora.
Awesome, thanks, Christine. That was a lot packed into a very short space of time. Thank you so much. I love the billboard, by the way. I think that was great. Yeah, and really interesting point about the Climate Change Commission and officials both kind of providing advice about reducing the dairy herd that didn't end up making its way into the ERP. Awesome. What we're going to do in terms of questions is that we'll go to our next speakers first, and then we'll have a decent amount of time for questions at the end of that. So if you have any questions for either Christine or our next speakers, Alana and Emily, please put them in the Q&A down the bottom of your little Zoom window, and we'll get to those a bit later on in the webinar. So the next people we have are Alana, Kane and Emily Mabin-Sutton from 350 Aotearoa and Fossil Free State Sector Coalition. So 350.org is a global organisation, collaboration of organisers, community groups and regular people fighting for a fossil-free future. And 350 Aotearoa is our branch here in Aotearoa. It's a member of the Fossil Free State Sector Coalition, a group of climate justice organisations working together to achieve a fossil-free state sector. And so we have Alana Kane joining us. So Alana has been working in the community sector doing organising and advocacy work for over 10 years, originally from Taranaki, home of, I guess, some of the where some of the kind of just transitions issues of climate are really starting to bite. She's 350 Aotearoa's mobilisation and campaign manager, focusing on fossil-free state sector campaign. And Emily Mabin-Sutton is the lead researcher for Fossil-Free State Sector Coalition and also co-founder of Climate Club, which you can probably tell us a little bit more about too. And in her day job, she is a product consultant for tech companies and runs a startup helping teams be more inclusive with the app called Say My Name. So welcome and thank you very much for coming.
Kia ora. Thank you, Andrew. Cool. So my name's Alana. I am as Andrew said, the Fossil Free State Sector Coalition campaigns and mobilisation manager under the 350 umbrella. And I'll just let Emily also introduce herself quickly to say hi.
Kia ora. Lovely to meet you all. I'm the lead researcher at Fossil Free State Sector Climate Club and also volunteer at 350 Aotearoa.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to talk a little bit today about what we've been up to, what we were hoping to hear from the ERP and the budget, and what we didn't hear. So yeah, I'll first of all just start a bit about who we are. So we're a coalition of climate justice organisations, Andrew mentioned this before, and unions working together to achieve fossil-free state sector. So that includes the Coal Action Network, PPTA, NZEI, 350 Aotearoa, Aotearoa, the New Zealand Climate and Health Council. And although Rachel said that PSA is a member, not yet a formalised member, but is there supporting us, and so is Enviro Schools. And we also have a number of volunteers involved. So collectively, we represent thousands of people across Aotearoa, united for the vision of a clean powered, equitable and just future for all. So we've been working on a campaign. The campaign that we've been working on has been focusing on holding the government accountable for the promise it made in 2020, which was that the state sector would be carbon neutral by 2025. I just want to note as well that it's carbon neutral, not decarbonised, but ideally that means a decarbonised state sector. So since forming in 2020, we've been campaigning for complete decarbonisation of state sector and trying to hold the government accountable to this statement. Recently, it's been more focused on schools. So we've been doing a lot of work within schools, trying to mobilise students, trying to get them involved and find out what kind of boilers that they had in their schools, and calling for change, because there's a number of boilers still being run on fossil fuels in schools, which I'll talk a little bit to soon, because there was some cool announcements about that recently. But we will be shifting our focus, and it's also always been on hospitals, prisons, universities and other public buildings, so also all public buildings within like council, state sector, and also just in general the sort of state sector department emissions, so making sure that these are being measured and shared. So we're asking for, from our campaign, an immediate ban on all new fossil fuel boilers in the state sector, a commitment to transition all existing fossil fuel boilers and renewably sourced power by 2025, and additionally budget allocation to support that transition. The release of clear steps on the application process for grants from the Clean Powered State Sector Fund. At the moment, it's pretty hard for different organisations or different sectors to actually find out how to access funding to be transitioned. The publication of a list of all state sector institutions, including local authorities, that are still burning fossil fuels for heat. So we've managed to access some information, but it's mainly through OIAs. So it's pretty hard to find out who's actually burning fossil fuels. And an investment in public transport and reduction in air travel by government over electrifying, rather than electrifying the fleet, which seems to be the sort of go-to at the moment. We've had three sort of key areas that we've been focusing on, which I mentioned before, which was hospitals, education and prisons. So hospitals, DHBs and hospital buildings. Education includes schools and universities, which has been a key focus, although not on universities. And I think that's somewhere that we need to also focus on. And prisons. So I'm going to pass over, and I guess also on this, maybe if you'd like to have a little think about where you work and if you know what the building heating source currently is, because often we don't even think about that, and whether or not you might be able to have some influence there as well if there is something, if they are burning fossil fuels. So I'm going to pass over to Emily to talk a little bit more to the data and numbers, because that's not me. So I'll pass over to her and she can talk to sort of explain as well this extent of the issue, and then we're just going to talk a little bit about what we were hoping to see in the ERP and the budget.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alana. And I think the overall sentiment here is that we love the ambition that the Carbon Neutral Government Program has got to. When we did the digging, we noticed and found that the government, like industry, like everyone, is deeply embedded in the fossil fuel industry at a high level. So in terms of the Carbon Neutral Government Program, they do now have to report. So all government departments will be reporting by the end of 2022. So far, 9 have disclosed their emissions and their overall carbon footprint. And really big components of that are air travel and transport, which is why it's such a really key part to get right in the emissions reduction plan. And really it's vehicle and air travel that has been reported on, so a mixture of both. And then overall in the state sector, I don't know if you know, but I'm about to nerd out a lot on boilers. So there are a lot of coal, oil, diesel still being used in heating across government departments. So even in councils, hospitals, everywhere. So I'll go into the numbers there. So overall, 83% of hospitals and 94% of prisons and 40% of schools and educational institutes are burning fossil fuels for heating. And this is one of the areas that we really hope the government would lead the way on. They also funded the GIDI, Decarbonising Industry Fund. So they put 600 million into that, but they actually haven't put very much. They've put 200 million into decarbonising the state sector. And we wish it was the other way around, because that would easily be eaten up by what we have here. To name a few top like institutes, and this is not to blame them. Like what's happened here is we've been a fossil fuel embedded nation for a long time, and the easiest and fastest installations were gas, coal, and large, especially for heating large institutes. Fonterra also has, I think, over 80 boilers. But large institutes have commonly used fossil fuels, but the problem is large because of this. So Auckland District Health Board burns over 100 million kilowatt hours of gas. Multiple universities have gas boilers and gas systems for their heating. And then it's a pity as well because large prisons still burn a lot of coal, which is also really poisonous for people in prisons breathing in that air, in those emissions. And then not fun fact, people in prisons also work on dairy farms, which corresponds to roughly half of the emissions when you equate to carbon dioxide tons emitted across corrections emissions overall. If you'd like to know more about your institution's footprint and their heating, I'd love to give you the data, and you can also advocate for transforming and transitioning there.
Cool.
On to Alana for past wins.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so I thought we'd talk a little bit to what we have managed to do with this campaign. In 2020, there was this announcement of decarbonising the state sector. There was 219.5 million allocated to the state sector for decarbonisation funds in 2020. The 55 million of that was towards schools. And that has resulted in at least 90 schools being transitioned to, well, ideally renewable, although there has been some that have transitioned from coal to gas. We also had a petition handover to ban new installations of fossil fuel boilers, and that's currently in the process of being looked at and hopefully will get put through. And we recently had an announcement, actually pre-ERP, the week before, that there would be an extra $10 million, but I'm pretty sure that's from the 219.5 million towards schools, all schools that are currently burning coal, to transition off coal boilers in the next 3 years. But I would just like to note that although that sounds awesome, and it means that a lot of South Island schools, for example, will be on renewables, there's still 600 schools burning gas or diesel. And the rest of the money that they announced in that announcement was to go towards smaller decarbonisation projects, but most of them were focused on more electric vehicle fleets and not actually the systemic or infrastructural gas and heating systems or systems that we use. So basically, there hasn't been much put towards, for example, DHBs or especially prisons, and I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. I've just got this slide here to sort of, if we're thinking there's been 220 million put forward, the amount that we actually need, or the estimated cost to replace all fossil fuel boilers in the state sector, is $1.6 billion. So it's a very small fraction of what's been put forward. So I guess, what does that mean? We were really excited about the ERP because we thought maybe there would be some more plans in there around sort of what ideas, looking at how we might decarbonize the state sector. And so we were hoping to see at least something, and also more urgent deadlines around phasing out coal. And so we also from that, I suppose, for the budget, we're hoping to see at least a fraction of that 1.6 billion going towards being allocated towards actually taking some action on decarbonising state sector. Unfortunately, we did not see any of that. In fact, we just got a very small snippet in the ERP about that they had already allocated this 220 million, and that that there would be plans to offset from 2025. So I guess the key outcome for us from the ERP was that it was confirmed that there would be offsetting from 2025 for all of those buildings that did not manage to decarbonize beforehand. And I feel like this is a real cop-out. It means that from 2025, the government will offset the vast majority of emissions to around, and that'll be about 1 to 6 million per department per year. So I just think that we're not addressing the actual cause of emissions, and instead trying to mask it with the sort of offsetting when there's definitely opportunities to take action. So currently we've not got high expectations for the budget, but it would be great to see a little bit more funding put in there, especially towards, I think, hospitals, prisons, and there's been a lot for schools, but also universities. So we've got a little bit about our asks. So the things that we're kind of also asking for is the continued reporting and reducing to avoid offsetting. So actually knowing how much emissions are, how much each department is emitting. That we would push towards public transport and infrastructure for public transport, and not this car culture that we're seeing with the EV, the focus being on EVs, and also just decarbonize the state sector. So we'll continue to push for that. In terms of next steps, we would really like PSA members especially could take some action in your workplace. So maybe if you're really passionate about this or interested, have a look at what heating systems you have in place. Could you organize your co-workers to maybe take some action? Look out for some petitions to sign. We're hoping that we will have some petitions. We will have some petitions up related to those specific areas. We've had ones for schools and for the new installations of fossil fuel boilers, but not related to specifically hospitals or prisons or council buildings, for example. And election year's coming up, so it's a good time to campaign. And I think this is something that we need to say we don't want to offset, we want action and we want change. So do, if you have a moment, try and take some steps towards those things within your own workplace. And you can find us online. So if you want to find out more about the Fossil Free State Sector Coalition, you can look us up, and you can also check out 350 Aotearoa if you're interested. Yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much. Also, please feel free to email Emily, or you can just email 350@350.org.nz if you're interested in finding out some specifics about your institutions and what sort of emissions or what they're currently doing with their heating. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. That was, yeah, really interesting. And it's an interesting question. Like, do you know how your workplace is powered and if that's sustainable, or if it's like a coal boiler or gas or something? To be honest, I had always just assumed, you know, we don't have that many boilers around. So to see some of the figures you're talking about is actually kind of a little startling and scary, really. Yeah, and also I thought it was particularly interesting thinking about the money departments are going to have to spend on offsetting if they haven't dealt with their carbon footprint in just a couple of years' time, because I guess well, I guess that's one question I'd like to jump into, actually. And before I do, if any of you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, because I'd like to be able to pass them on to our speakers. But yeah, I guess one question I wanted to start off with is the opponents of doing anything about climate change always point to cost as being the biggest barrier. And so I was just wondering if any of you have any kind of thoughts or comments about the level of investment that you saw talked about in the ERP versus what's needed, and where would you kind of suggest that kind of funding would come from? Like, what do you think the government should be doing differently in terms of finding the money to pay for the change that's needed?
I can start perhaps, because for the agricultural sector, the turning off the tap is going to be much more efficient and affordable than offsetting or mitigating. And so phasing out synthetic nitrogen fertiliser, which is driving so much of our emissions and so much of the dairy intensification, is a really good first step towards addressing climate change. And it doesn't come with a big budget, it just means applying less fertiliser and having a pathway to phase it out through time, which has been, the instrument for that is probably through the freshwater reforms, which require councils to review their policy statements to get down below the 190 kilo per hectare cap, which, that's a lot of fertiliser when you think about it. And so if they just lower that cap through those council instruments, then you don't need to offset, you don't need to, pay anybody out, you just need to apply less of this stuff. So there are quick wins that can be had by applying much less synthetic nitrogen fertiliser and lowering the dairy herd.
Awesome, thanks, Christine. Alana and Emily.
I don't know if Emily has any idea about, more figures wise, but in terms of money and where's it coming from? You can kind of see, I think most of the money is coming from the emissions. I actually don't want to comment on this because I'm not sure,
No
but
worries.
it's coming from the big emitters, right? So
yeah, emissions.
But what I've been seeing as well is that a lot of that money is also going back to them in terms of to help, for example, with Aotearoa or to lower, or industry to lower their to get off, for example, to decarbonize their boilers. So it's kind of like, okay, you're taking money from them, you're giving it back, but why don't we then funnel that to other areas and ask if they've probably got enough money to do that themselves. Yes, they do hold up a lot of our economy in whatever way, but I think, yeah, that's something to be thinking about. And also just, tax the rich, I'll pass to Emily.
Just a note on the cost there, I think as well, like what you've highlighted and what we highlighted with the cost of offsetting is the opportunity cost. And just like climate change as a whole, it's like either we invest now and transition now, or we pay more later. And I think what we've seen in this decarbonisation budget being so low is the government is still making the decision to pay more later, even when it's in financial framing. Like over the next 10 years only, the government is going to pay over $2 billion in offsetting unless they transition. That's more than the cost to decarbonise. And that's only in 10 years. And that's assuming the price of the emissions trading scheme, or the NZU, stays at $90. And it won't, it will increase, hopefully. So agreed. Like, I think we were disappointed to hear that the agricultural sector was benefiting from the emissions trading scheme funding, because more of that should be put into decarbonisation. But I think as well, we wanted more urgent funding towards decarbonisation and more signaling, virtue signaling in terms of mode shift, active transport and public transport as well, over continuing to invest in roads and cars. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got a question and also a kind of comment related, I suppose. Question was, do you think the government can do all this, or are kind of economic powers too powerful? And a similar kind of comment in the chat about there are kind of huge powerful groups kind of opposing this type of movement. I guess, yeah, any comments on that?
I think that the community was expecting something bolder, especially from a majority government. I think industry itself was surprised just seeing the reaction from federated farmers, and National said that industry could actually afford to pay for decarbonisation themselves, which is shocking because, and this is the thing, is like the GIDI fund, the Decarbonising Industry Fund, got 600 million, 650. And they're saying they don't need it, or at least the leader of the National Party is saying they don't need it. So I think ultimately, again, as long as it's an opportunity cost, and as long as the government is signalling that industry will need to pay their emissions at some point, which most industry will, except for agriculture, then they will see that the opportunity cost is that there is a cost to not transitioning. And so as long as the price and the cost of offsetting, and that there will be requirements on industry to be carbon neutral at some point, is signaled, then industry will. I think that we just haven't necessarily seen a strong enough signal from the government of what they expect from all sectors. That's my personal view.
Yeah, I'd agree. And if not from this government, then the prospects from any other government are much lower, given the social and political capital that this government has had, and also given the rhetoric that came from the Prime Minister when back in 2017, with the nuclear-free moment, and then subsequently with the climate emergency. So, and the fact that we've got a Green Party climate change minister, and so if we've got something so weak that caters so badly to the dairy sector and agriculture generally, both with letting them off the hook and giving them all this money, and then funding Fonterra to phase out its coal boilers for drying milk powder, it might as well be a national government. And, interesting even that Christopher Luxon was saying that the emissions reduction plan is corporate welfare, although he did note corporate welfare, but he didn't direct that criticism at the corporate welfare angled at the agricultural sector. So, it was a really inconsistent message, but it's it's a betrayal of the people of New Zealand to give the dairy sector and agriculture the lion's share of the benefits, while everybody else except the agricultural sector and the dairy sector pay. So there's a real injustice, and I think it's a betrayal of the Labour Party's roots and of the Green Party supporters.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question, and we've probably only got time for one or two more. So the question is, we as in civil society groups like NGOs and unions need to present an alternative vision, and are there any what are your plans, what are your ideas, how do you think we do that?
For Greenpeace, the alternative vision is, as a country that grows plant-based regenerative organic products, and we're a long way from our markets, and so this idea of using 1,000 litres of water to produce 1 litre of milk, that then we burn a whole lot of coal to get rid of that water from the milk, and then we export around the world. It can only be a short-term model, and unfortunately it's a classic case of the costs being socialised and the profits being privatised. And so, we do need to have a vision for this alternative model, and clearly, people need to eat, but we don't need to eat animal products, and we don't need to export them around the world, especially given most of our dairy products are exported to become filler and junk food, or to replace breastfeeding, mother's milk, in a really cynical way of displacing, the people's milk. And so, we need to find a better way of farming and a better way of sustaining our economy.
Yeah, I think as well, it's really important at the moment to collaborate and be really collective in terms of looking towards change. And it's been interesting, I think, especially in the climate justice space, but there's so many different organizations working on different things, I think, and maybe what you're speaking to in this question, Tim, is that it would be really awesome to see a collective state, and especially an alternative statement, as a response to the ERP, what could we actually do collectively and with all our different, and what are the plans there? And I think there's lots of different organizations working on things individually. 350 Aotearoa has also running an energy campaign, so that's around how we can get better renewable energy, and talks a lot as well to sort of the farce that is the current energy market in New Zealand. And so I guess if we could have some of those different things come together, and it could be our own ERP, I suppose, and hand that over, something like that would be really awesome. But I think it takes people power. I think it means that people need to become more active, get more energized, and become motivated in this space. And I think it gets really easy for people to turn off, especially because it's such a blaring issue and we're all kind of like, oh, I don't want to, I think people need to start raising their voices and talking more about this and really actively creating for some collective change. Yeah, it's my thoughts on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Alana. That's probably a good note to end it on. A bit of a call to action. Because we are at time. So apologies for people who have had questions, but we haven't been able to get to them all. It's great that you have so many questions though. Just want to say thank you to our speakers, Christine, Alana, and Emily. And thanks for all of the work that all of you are doing in this area to kind of hold government to account and to advocate for more action. Thank you for everyone who came along. It's really good to see so many of you here. And there's one more webinar coming up on Friday in our series, in which Craig Rennie, the economist for the CTU, will be kind of dissecting tomorrow's budget to see what's in there. But that is all for us. So I will just end with karakia. Kia whakairea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumie hui tai kie. Thank you all so much, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Andrew.
Kia ora. Thanks, Andrew.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.